Uh, he praised their courage, told them God needs courageous people, but not for the kind of war that they were fighting. He's calling them to another war. He appreciated the freedom the Irish had. The Irish loved freedom. The Celts loved freedom. Right? How many of you seen the movie Braveheart? And well, William Wallace's famous battle cry, freedom! Now, it's not a very historically accurate movie, but the sentiment of freedom that it embodies in the Celts is a true representation of that inner drive in their culture. And the Scots also were Celtic people. Patrick was a missions innovator. He set up evangelistic monasteries. The monasteries that Patrick set up across Ireland were not places of retreat for people to get away from the world. They were evangelistic centers where people came, were trained in, and then were sent out through the rest of the country. They went out and they would plant another evangelistic monastery. And this was so effective that basically within Patrick's life, he saw a substantial part of Ireland converted. Been famously said that he found Ireland an island of sinners and left it an island of saints. The gospel began to move forward again. This missionary form of monastery gave a basis for that to happen. He began to receive the bards into the church. As I say, the bards were the Druid priests and the keepers of music. And Patrick began to incorporate them, though this would be a little problem later on we'll look at. One of the aspects of Irish society that was unique was that men and women, there was a fundamental equality between men and women. And Patrick carried that into the Celtic church. We actually have records of women priests and at least one woman bishop. So women in senior leadership in the church there in Ireland. The Irish loved stories, they loved words, they loved scholarship. They hadn't had a high degree of literacy before Patrick's arrival. He brought literacy into the island, and being lovers of words, they embraced it wholeheartedly. Ireland became, over time, a center of learning in Europe. There's a time in European history that people traveled to Ireland from Rome in order to learn Latin.
Wow.
Because they had learned it so well. Thomas Cahill, I've mentioned many times already so far, his first book in the Hinges of History series is How the Irish Saved Civilization. And it's a story of Patrick and the Irish Church. One of the things he said, that with this love of learning, with this love of literature, they embraced literature from outside of Ireland. They embraced the learning from outside of Ireland. They recognized that all truth is God's truth, therefore we should seek to preserve it. And they went to, as they traveled across the sea, being seafaring people, they tried to seek out and collect manuscripts and survive the destruction of the Germanic invasions and brought them back to Ireland and copied them. It was key in preserving the learning from the ancient world. Some of the learning that we have today from Greece and Rome, we have because of the faithfulness of the Irish copyists who, with poor light in cells, spent time diligently copying them and illustrating them beautifully. I was just in Ireland in September and went to see the Book of Kells, the illuminated Irish manuscript, that exquisitely beautiful. So you have a whole new culture emerging. So as I say, by the time Patrick died, much of Ireland was substantially converted. The next major step in terms of the Celtic Church was founded by Columba on the island of Iona off the west coast of Scotland in 563. Became the base for evangelizing Scotland. Columba did essentially the same thing Patrick had done. He used Iona as an evangelistic base to reach out to Scotland, and then bases there would similarly carry out evangelism and plant evangelistic monasteries. And then that began to move down to England. England had been conquered and basically repopulated by Anglo-Saxon Germanic tribes following the collapse of the Roman Empire. And the Celtic Church from Scotland began to reach out to them. But while Columba was still alive, they came up against a question about the bards. Irish Celtic music had been developed explicitly originally to worship pagan Irish gods. The question was raised, can such music that's being used to worship pagan gods be used to worship the one true God? The kings and nobles of Ireland had an interest in this because the bards were also political satirists, and their satire could be biting. So the kings had a desire to try and rein in the bards, limit them, or even abolish the order of the bards. There's a conference that was held to actually discuss it. Columba was one of the most respected scholars of his day. And though actually he was exiled to Iona, that's why he originally went to Iona, he was exiled for participation in a war or encouragement of a war in Ireland. He was called back to give advice as to what should they do about the order of the bards. And the Cahill tells a story that he goes into the meeting and basically shares that this is part of who we are. This is our culture. This is something, the beauty that we need to be preserved. He's in the meeting with all of the powerful people, and the bards are outside the hallway waiting to hear the outcome of the decision. And Columba carries the day, and there's a picture, the story of the bards rushing into the hall, taking him and putting him on their shoulders as a thank you, just that he had preserved them. So one of the reasons we have Celtic music today, I love Celtic music, is because Patrick first and then Columba recognized that this is something belongs to Irish culture, something of beauty in Irish culture. It's something that should be preserved. The order of the bards should be preserved. And one of the sad things about missions history is that sometimes we would go to Africa and we'd hear people using drums to worship their spirits, to worship their pagan gods. And we would say, no, you can't use drums to worship. They're used to worship your pagan gods. We'll teach you our hymns. And some of those hymns, of course, are hymns that are to Celtic music. It's like we say, well, our worship of our old pagan gods, worship music of our old pagan gods is all right, but yours isn't. Patrick Columba understood the value of culture, that beautiful things could be preserved in culture. Key figure in reaching England from Scotland was named Aidan. He died in 651. And then the Celtic Church ran into a problem. As the church in Rome had been recovering from some of the destruction of the Dark Ages and sent out a missions group to reach England under a man named, another Augustine, but this time Augustine of Canterbury, who became the first Archbishop of Canterbury. He led the outreach from Rome to England in 596. And there were substantial differences between between Irish practice and Roman practice. It's important that we not think of these two groups as denominations. The Celts never considered themselves to be another church. They always said we're part of the one church. And but what do you do when you have substantial difference in practice? Their practices had changed because they'd been isolated for an extended period of time. They adopted features of Irish culture. As I say, women priests, at least one woman bishop. This is unheard of in the Roman Church. Another problem was the church calendar. The church calendar in Rome had changed because it was recognized it was not keeping with the change of seasons, change of the dates. It needed to be alterations. And so Pope Gregory established the Gregorian calendar. The Irish, having been separated, were under the Julian calendar. And that meant their dates for celebrating Easter and Christmas were different. It created a problem for one of the kings because he followed Roman dating of Lent, and his queen followed the Celtic dating of Lent. And one of the practices at that time in the church was that one of the ways of fasting was you fasted from sexual intercourse between husband and wife during Lent. But when your dates for Lent don't line up together, you have a problem. So the king wanted to resolve these things. He called a council to try and resolve it. Council of Whitby in 663. The Celtic Church had to make a choice. The king chose for the Roman customs. And would the Celtic Church submit to that, or would they divide the church? After some period of time and period of adjustment, the Celts chose to submit to the Roman custom. There were some some of the matters between them were not so significant. One of them was a tonsure, that the way they cut their hair to show that they were dedicated to God was different between the Celtic Church and the Roman Church. Let's say the dates of the calendar were different, but it also meant with being giving up having women priests, which was substantial, but they felt the unity of the church was more important. But the missions passion remained, and the Celts that were now free, having submitted to Roman custom, they're free to work among the Anglo-Saxons there in England and pass on to them the missions fire that the Celts had. So the Anglo-Saxon church, discipled by the Celts, began evangelistic outreach to the continent. J.R.R. Tolkien, you heard me say the influence he had in my life. One of his scholarly works I read, he makes a comment that England's mission to Europe in this period of time was perhaps the greatest gift of England to Europe in all of its history. They went over and began to re-evangelize. A key figure was Boniface. He's called the disciple or the apostle of German, or the apostle of the Germans. He lived from 675 to 754. Had enormous impact on Germany. In 723, he came to the town of Geismar. And Geismar was a center of pagan worship. It had a massive oak tree there that was centuries old and was part of pagan pilgrimage. And when he preached to the people in Geismar, they had no interest. We have Thor. We have Thor's oak tree right here in our midst. Thor, the god, the Norse god and German god of thunder and lightning. So Boniface wondered, okay, what do I do? How do I handle this situation? Prayed and felt that he had to confront the powers. This is common Irish practice. They recognize the power of the demonic in the world. And when they established the monastery, they would spend time doing spiritual warfare to cleanse the area they were building in. But Boniface felt he had to confront the spiritual power behind Thor's oak tree. So he got an axe. And he went up to the tree and started chopping. Now, there's no way in the world, this is a huge tree, no way in the world that he, with his axe by himself, could cut it down any reasonable length of time. And the people began to gather to watch him. And they weren't too concerned. They said, Thor is a god, he can take care of himself. And it looked as though that was going to happen because a dark cloud began to appear in the horizon. And it doesn't say it, but I can imagine perhaps the pagan crowd moved further back to make sure they didn't get in the way of Thor's thunderbolts. And Boniface cut in. And you know, sometimes just as a storm breaks, there's a big gust of wind that suddenly hits you. That happened with the tree. A gust of wind from this storm hit the tree, and this oak that stood for centuries fell. And Gaspar came to Christ. Wow. And then Boniface had them cut up the tree into lumber, and they built a chapel from it.
Wow. Wow.
So the Celtic Church and those who were discipled by it had a major role of re-evangelizing Europe, and it was just in time because other events were taking place at the same time, a period of time that we're looking at, way back in the Middle East, in the Arabian Peninsula. Muhammad was born in 570, and he would die in 632. As I said, differences in the church in the Middle East, in Egypt, Syria, Palestine, present-day Turkey, led to the persecution of some groups of Christians by other groups of Christians as they gained political power. So you have, when I say persecution, I'm actually talking about Christians were killing each other. They were being executed by the civil authority. They're being killed by mobs. All of them were Trinitarians. It was just over how could Jesus be both God and man? Well, how did that work? So you had a situation where you have a divided church. Muhammad, during his lifetime, basically spread the word of his new religion with one God, Allah, calling all people to submit to him, converted Arabia, died suddenly in 632, and we're not entirely sure why, just totally unexpected. After a period of rivalry between some of his followers, they launched an invasion out into the rest of the Middle East. So in a very short time, they conquered the old Persian Empire. They went into Syria, into Palestine, into Egypt. But they were desert fighters. They were technologically at a relatively low level and did not have high-level military technology. And the great cities of the Middle East were great fortress cities. And talk about Antioch, you talk about Damascus, you talk about Jerusalem, you talk about Alexandria. These cities were massively fortified. How could desert raiders capture them? And the way to capture them was because Christians inside cooperated with them to surrender their cities to them, because they'd been persecuted by other Christians. They thought they'd get a better deal from these, from the Arabs than they were getting from their own Christian brothers and sisters. And to them, Muhammad's faith at that point didn't sound that different. He was preaching one God. And they had no idea what they were doing. They had no idea that they were turning their children and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren down to the present day over to Islam. It was divided church that made possible the Arab conquest of the Middle East and the eventual Islamization of the whole region. There's still large pockets of Christians who remain faithful. We have the Copts in Egypt. We have some ancient churches who are still there, though many of them have been destroyed, particularly recently by ISIS. There's a substantial church in Palestine that dates back way into church history. But the area was basically the heartland of Christianity. It's an area where Jesus had lived and walked. The apostles had seen the birth of the early church. was lost because of the division of the church. We'll look and see that the other greatest loss of the Christian church in its history also came about because of division within the church. After conquering the Middle East, they also pushed the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, which still existed, and it's existed until 1453. They conquered much of Turkey, which had been the Byzantine province. All the areas, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, they were all Byzantine, part of the Byzantine Empire, now part of the Islamic Caliphate. Then they began to move their way across North Africa. And in the early 700s, they crossed from North Africa into Spain. And conquered most of Spain, crossed the Pyrenees Mountains into southern France. Europe was being threatened, and I need to, let's see, I need to open another file here. Almost there, sorry. Should have opened it before or during the break. Sherman 32, you look, remember it's overlaps with some of Boniface's life. So we're seeing the Celts were actively re-evangelizing Europe at the time that the Muslim invasions happened. 732, Islamic army was approaching Paris, came the French, between the two French towns of Tours and Poitiers. And there they met the beginning of basically the rise of a new people group. So we've been looking at the Celts, that we're going to look at the Germans. We talked about that there's migration of the German tribes that had laid the foundations or had destroyed the foundations of the Roman Empire. The Germans highly prized personal freedom, like the Celts. They'd forcefully resisted Romans' attempts to conquer them in order to preserve their freedom. Where pagan kings in the Middle East and Rome had been absolute rulers, the Germans valued their freedom too highly to allow this. So they wanted to curb the power of their king. And the way they did that was to have a king's council composed of leading members of the tribe whose purpose was to represent the people and the power of the king. In particular, the king had to gain the approval of the council in order to levy taxes. His council would become known as, coming from the French word, parler, would become known as a parlement, the parliament. The origins of the parliament in Western Europe date back to the King's Council of the Germanic tribes. It was a structure, was a very useful way to structure the development of representative governments. And eventually it developed a situation where you had one house would represent the common people, the lower chamber of the House, and the other would represent the nobility. So in England, you have the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The German tribe of the Franks had conquered most of what today is France, and that's where the name France comes from, and established a kingdom there under the rule of the mayors of Paris. Under the Celtic churches, the Franks had accepted the gospel. As the Muslim army was approaching Paris in 732, the mayor of Paris, Charles Martel, met them between the villages of Tours and Poitiers. So sometimes if you read history, you'll read this battle is called the Battle of Tours, it's sometimes called the Battle of Poitiers. Charles Martel met the invading army, and for the first time really in its history, an invading Muslim army was defeated. There had been continual expansion of Islam since the time of Muhammad up to this moment. Now, I think it's important to make the point that Charles Martel was not fighting a crusade. He didn't claim to be fighting the crusade. He was basically a Christian king who was defending his people against an invading army. Now, I am not a pacifist. I think that Romans 13 indicates that God does give the authority to the state to use deadly force to protect its citizens. So police force or military. I very heartily support the Ukrainians right now in their defense against Russian invasion. I have many friends who are pacifists, but I don't see that. I highly regard, though, the early church and stand for peace against the Roman authorities there. We talked about that yesterday. Charles Martel defeated the Islamic armies invading France. But I would contend that the more important job had been done by the Celts. They provided the spiritual foundations that he could build on to militarily defeat them. It was a re-evangelized Western Europe and a united church that hadn't divided, that met and defeated this first Islamic challenge. I want to just draw the comparison in terms of the Middle East, where you had a divided church that opened the way for Islam to conquer it. The Celtic church, not knowing what the consequences of their decision would be, made the decision not to divide the church, the Council of Whitby, that allowed them to pursue evangelizing the continent, and meant it was a united church that was on the continent, spiritually united, that was, I think, was key in resisting the Islamic invasion at this point. Sometimes we do not know the consequences of what our decisions are. The Celts didn't know what would be at stake when they chose unity. And it cost them something. But I think, given the historical context, it was right. The other thing I'll just make in terms of the the issue, particularly of women. I'm very sensitive to that. I am a major supporter of women in ministry and leadership. I am proud to belong to WAWAM, a mission where any woman from any nation could one day head this mission. That women have full place within this mission. What I see in history is that God in the church has found ways to keep raising up women in spite of the efforts of some men to keep them down. So he raised up orders of nuns who had the kind of wisdom and spiritual insight that actually kings, rulers, and popes sought them out. They were women who were ministering to the poor, who were preaching the gospel, carrying through the call of the church. So God was faithful, in spite of the wrong view of men that often brought into the church from the Greeks that impacted the church. The grandson of Charles Bartel is Charlemagne. He lived 742 to 814. He would unite much of Western Europe under his rule. It was crowned by the Pope eventually as the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, one person has made the clever statement, well, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but he established again some sense of unity that had been lost in the years of the Dark Ages. He gave a political unity. He promoted schooling. He established schools. He himself was illiterate, but he learned to write his own name, to sign his own name, in order to set an example of literacy for his people. His intent was to establish an explicitly Christian empire. Unfortunately, you see with him some of the problems of mixing church and state, problems of Christendom, so he used the sword to conquer pagan Germanic peoples, particularly the Saxons. He conquered them and gave them the option of conversion or the sword. And so they were baptized, but it wasn't a very willing conversion. Departing from the way of someone like Boniface, who preached to them, bringing the gospel to them. After Charlemagne's death, the centralized empire that he'd built collapsed. In Germany now came the seat of the emperor, who exercised a loose authority over the many German states, but kept the idea of a united Europe alive, especially now with Christianity giving a cultural unity to the continent. But the fire of the Celtic Church gradually burnt out, and the problems with success spiritually is a temptation to wealth and power, and the Celtic monasteries became centers of wealth. People gave to them because of their spiritual ministry, but that meant they became wealthy. And that attracted the notice of another people group, the Vikings or Norsemen. Technically, the Vikings a Viking, or Viking was something that they did. It wasn't who they were. You went Viking, which meant you went out pillaging and burning and taking loot back home. The Norsemen, one of the prayers of the church at this time was, Lord, deliver us from the fury of the Norsemen. June 8, 793, the Abbey of Lindisfarne, which was founded by Aidan, one of the earliest missionaries to England, was sacked by a Viking raid. Detracted by the wealth. That's, you see this continually through it in terms of the Vikings going, and they've targeted churches because they knew churches and monasteries, because they knew they're centers of wealth. They knew they would find gold and silver there, and slaves. The Vikings had new foreign technology. The longboat was a maritime innovation. It allowed the longboat, the ship, to carry large numbers of people, but it had shallow draft. It didn't go deep, so it could go up the rivers of Europe easily. Their raids and invasions continued until the 11th century. As I say, they would carry off slaves, often the women. And this ended up having a role in changing the character of Viking culture, because the women would be carried off as slaves. Sometimes their masters would marry them. They'd have children, and the wives would have a major role in raising the children, and they would raise their children as Christians. So in carrying off Christian wives, the Vikings undermined much of the pagan influence that had, or much of their own paganism. By the 11th century, they began to be part of the power struggle among the different European powers, rather than raiders and invaders. A major development in this time, also a beginning, also parallel with what Patrick was doing in Ireland. So we have to go back to look at the continent now, was the development of Western monasticism, founded by Benedict, the 480 to 547. He founded the Benedictine order and set up a monastery in Monte Cassino in Italy. So what you see happening here is something that repeats itself in missions, in church history and missions history, that a charismatic leader launches a new movement that meets the needs of the day. Patrick did the same in Ireland. Lauren Cunningham and George Verwer did the same thing in modern missions. They started a new movement that attracted and spoke to the needs and met the needs of our day, and established a whole new missions movement. Well, there are two different missions movements, Operation Mobilization and Youth the Mission. The life in a Benedictine monastery revolved around worship and work. Life was built around the regular schedule of prayer through the day. So there was these set times of prayer and worship. And in between those times of prayer and worship, there would be working in the fields, because the monasteries, the Benedictine monasteries, were economically self-sufficient. They'd be given large tracts of land by a local ruler and they would then have to farm them. They would learn farming techniques, which they would then teach other people. They became centers of growing communities as people would gather to them. They would teach farming. They were centers of medicine and healing for their communities. They discovered that there was some kind of connection between stagnant bodies of water and malaria. Malaria was very common in Europe at this time. And they didn't know what the connection was. They didn't realize that the vector was a mosquito, but they recognized that large bodies of stagnant water allowed the spread of malaria. So they drained the swamps of Europe, which is one of the reasons that malaria basically doesn't exist in Europe anymore. It's because of the work of the monasteries in this period of time. They're centers of scholarship, renewal. They're doing community development, what we would today call community development. They became new centers in which a new renewal movement would happen in the church. Now, we're going to look at something which probably you may never have heard of, and it's a strange sounding term, so I'll have to explain what the issue was, but it's of central importance in the development of European civilization and human rights and freedoms. It's called the investiture conflict. Just out of curiosity, have any of you ever heard of the investiture controversy or conflict? As we've seen, when the Roman Empire collapsed in the West, all central authority broke down. And so we had the Dark Ages. In the absence of central authority, the church stepped in to fill the vacuum, serving their communities, providing a place of common identification. In some instances, the churches were spared some of the destruction that devastated Europe, but still learning declined in the church and was only kept alive in the monasteries. But even in the church, ignorance and corruption was growing and spreading. There was increasing immorality. The clergy were uneducated. Some of them could do no more than recite the Lord's Prayer and the Ten Commandments. Ignorance was widespread. In 1050, the Benedictine monastery of Cluny in France became the center of a widespread reform movement which would reshape Europe and the church. They set out to do a number of things. They set out to educate the clergy, educate the priests and bishops in the church so that they were literate, they could read the scriptures, they could read literature that was available. They reformed the sexual morals among the clergy. They replaced some where that was necessary. They demanded that the clergy live up to the sexual demands of the gospel in terms of how we live. Now, unfortunately, at this stage, the church at large was largely, the priesthood could not marry. And so there was immorality in the church because priests took concubines, but they couldn't marry them. But this is a terrible example for everyone else. So Cluny basically sought to reform the sexual morals among the clergy. They stood against corruption and the corrupting influence of wealth in the church. They renewed scholarship in the church through monasteries, and beginning now, we see shortly the founding of the universities. In fact, one of the key events was the rediscovery of Roman law that had been codified by the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian, which codified Roman law as modified by biblical law and biblical understanding. And the first university in Europe was in Bologna. My master's degree that I just completed is with Newman University in the UK, and but it's under the Bologna system that dates back to this period. Bologna is the first Western university, and it was set up to begin to study Justinian's code. Because central authority was weak, the Cluny reform began to develop a different view of the relationship of church and state. These would eventually become familiar with us in terms of thinking of the spheres. So they began with saying that church and state are co-equals with two different spheres of authority. This would have its clearest articulation later, especially with people like John Calvin and the Dutch theologian Abraham Kuyper. When we speak of life spheres and YWAM, this is the tradition we're looking back to. Later, as the church became powerful again, it would abuse this and declare the state was under the church and that therefore the king should submit to the Pope. But that would come later. In the mid-11th century, the leaders of Cluny became popes. And conflict erupted in what became known in history as the investiture conflict. And what that means, the whole thing was around the question of who would invest the bishop with their symbols of office. The bishop was invested, or bishop was ordained. He was given a shepherd's crook and a ring. Those were his symbols of office. And the question arose, who would give the bishop his symbols of office? And the German emperor, Henry IV, said that the church was under his authority, so he should appoint them. For the emperor, there's a practical issue involved. The only educated people in the kingdom were the clergy. He needed educated people to run his government, so he wanted the power to appoint them. But it was also a question of power. He wanted power over the church. The church, under Cluny's leadership, said that the church was under God's authority in matters of the church. So therefore, the church should appoint its own leaders. The conflict went on from about 1075 to 1122. The two major antagonists were Hildebrand, who was at first advisor to the Pope, and who later became Pope Gregory VII. And the emperor was Henry IV of Germany, Holy Roman Emperor. Henry demanded the right to appoint bishops and began to appoint them. But Gregory was not one of the later popes. He had no huge power. What he had was the authority of his character and the authority of his office. If the emperors had challenged the church's authority in the period when there was so much immorality, lack of scholarship, the church would have had a hard time standing up against the emperor. But Cluny's reform had reformed the church and given it moral authority. All that Gregory had was the moral authority of his office and the ability, because Henry claimed to be a Christian king. Gregory said, well, if you as a Christian king are a member of the church, therefore you're subject to church discipline. If you as a Christian act like a pagan, then we will consider you a pagans. Gregory excommunicated Henry. It was a radical move for the Pope to excommunicate the king. Henry held out for a while, but eventually he submitted and came in midwinter to the papal palace of Canossa in northern Italy to ask forgiveness. Apparently, Gregory made him stand outside in the snow for 3 days to make sure that he was serious, but then received him, granted his forgiveness, lifted the excommunication. But Gregory's fears about Henry had been well-founded because Henry, once again, demanded the right to appoint bishops. He was excommunicated again. He forced Gregory to go into exile at one point. But the real decision had been made when Henry went to Canossa. The emperor had submitted to the Pope in who would decide the matter of the leadership of the church. In 1122, after both Henry and Gregory were long dead, a compromise was reached. It was really a face-saving compromise for the emperor. The compromise, the church would appoint its own leaders. So the church would appoint the bishops, but it would allow the emperor to give them the staff and the ring. The church had won the point that the church chooses its leaders. The leadership of the church is not subject to the authority of the king. Later, this would become abused, as I said, so the church would claim the king was under its authority in matters of government. This was a great victory for the development of freedoms in the West, because if the church could establish a separate authority from the emperor, that gave place for the development of other spheres of society separate from the authority of the emperor. And there's a book on law called Law and Revolution that talks about, charts the whole process of the investiture conflict. It's written by a Jew. He's not a Christian, but he recognizes that the roots of the constitutional liberties in the West actually date back to, in many ways, to the investiture conflict, when the power of the state was limited and gave place for the church and ultimately for other spheres to emerge. By a man named Harold Berman, let's say a Jew who used to teach at Harvard University. I think he's dead now. Those of you who know something of the history of England can see parallels in this to the Magna Carta. There were the church and nobility united to limit the power of the king, again laying foundation for civil liberties in England. So there are further developments in monasticism. Europe is reviving economically at this point. We're at the end of the Dark Ages, moving into the early Middle Ages. Cities are beginning to develop as centers of commerce. International trade is opening up again. And cities have a unique form of poverty compared to the country, and unique needs in terms of ministry. So the Benedictine monasteries had been rural monasteries. A new monastic order, the Augustinians, emerged, who were based in the cities and looked to minister to the poor in the cities. They are also involved in education, scholarship. So again, the church finding innovative ways to meet the changing social situation. And then you had the preaching orders emerging. You had the Dominicans and you had the Franciscans. And can't spend a lot of time with the Franciscans, but I have to say something. There's probably no figure more loved in church history than Francis of Assisi. I don't know if you've noticed it or not. I say Francis of Assisi. I don't usually say Saint Francis. It's just my common practice. I didn't say Saint Patrick. I said Patrick. We're all saints. The honorific doesn't just belong to a select group of people. And so Francis is just Francis. He came sometime after the investiture conflict. He was born in 1181, died in 1226. We again see as the church had gone through a period of renewal. Renewal brings wealth, gains more power, leads to abuse. So we're in a period where the church is growing in wealth and power again. That's when Francis arrives on the scene. Popes become increasingly powerful, increasingly wealthy, as with the church throughout Europe. The Crusades have been launched, supposedly bringing the gospel with the sword. It's more complex than that. So, but they degenerated into that. At one point, they were called to a defensive war to aid the Eastern Roman Empire against Islam, but they became wars of aggression justified by Christianity. So we have a church which is wealthy and corrupt, and you have a new threat emerging. Actually, this was the first, this story is when I first began to rethink Christian history or history in terms of what I'm talking about in this week. I was reading a biography of Genghis Khan back in the early 1970s, and question just came to my mind: didn't Francis of Assisi live around this time? And I had no idea what that meant in terms of around this time, Middle Ages. Events were slow moving. He could have lived 100 years before. I didn't know my history so well then. He could have lived 100 years later. So I thought, well, that's an interesting question. Let's look and see when Francis lived. As I say, I was studying the life of Genghis Khan, reading a biography. He was born in 1162. He united all the tribes of Mongolia under his rule and set out a career of conquest unsurpassed in human history. He conquered much of China and then headed west. Everything that opposed him was swept away. Cities that tried to resist him were obliterated, their population slaughtered, and their artisans sent to his own capital to build his capital. They say Francis was born in 1181, probably converted around 1203 or 1205, we're not sure. Genghis, during Francis' life, is conquering his way westwards. Francis starts as a rich playboy. He comes from a wealthy family, enjoying the pleasures that wealth gives in terms of women, in terms of liquor. Nominally a Christian, but no commitment to Jesus. And then he is taken prisoner of war, and in time as a prisoner, he has a vision where God speaks to him, says, go and rebuild my temple that's in ruins. When he gets back to Assisi, he goes outside the city wall and finds a chapel that was ruined there. And he said, oh, that must be what God wants me to do. He wants me to rebuild this ruined chapel, this chapel of San Damiano. He begins to rebuild it. He also begins to preach the gospel to the poor. He begins to minister to the poor. Prior to his conversion, lepers had terrified him. The Crusades had brought the disease of leprosy into Europe, and there are many lepers that were in Europe now. And Francis had been terrified of them. With his conversion, he begins to reach out in grace and compassion, serving them, ministering to them. He begins to, a group of people begin to gather around him. They begin to go out, preach the gospel throughout Europe. He goes to the Pope. He gets recognized. Like Patrick, Francis was a great innovator. He started the preaching order, going out, not set in monasteries, but in going out in pairs to preach the gospel, following the example of Jesus. He loved God's creation. He loved the beauty of God's creation. He spoke about it. His Canticle of the Creatures, I have two prayers of Francis hanging in the wall of my study. One is Canticle of the Creatures, which is following the example of David, calling all of God's creation to worship God. And then his prayer, make me an instrument of your peace. This transformed the way that European art was done. Up until the time of Francis, European art was primarily religious. And if you've been to Orthodox churches with very highly stylized views of people, virtually no picture of creation at all, lots of gold, and to represent heaven. Francis has taught this world is good, God's world is good. And this allowed nature to be portrayed in a lifelike way for the first time in Western art. He used drama to communicate the gospel. He often around Christmas time churches, I think England, United States, will have live creches, live manger scenes where people dress up as shepherds, people dress up as wise men, and there's might be a baby, might be a doll in a manger. The first person to do that was Francis. He did it in the cathedral in Assisi. And he only had a doll in the manger, but it gave such a sense of the reality to the people who saw it that some actually thought they saw the doll in the crib moving like a baby. It communicated that this isn't just a myth in the history, it's something that actually happened. So you see the church called back to its original purpose, preaching the gospel, ministering to the poor. In 1227, Genghis' army reached the border of Western Europe. Nothing had stood between him and it, and nothing in Europe could stand up to Genghis' army. Genghis wasn't with it. He was back in the capital of Ulaanbaatar. And then news reached the army in 1227 that the great Khan Genghis had died. And according to Mongol tradition, they had to return to Ulaanbaatar to choose a new great Khan. The threat of invasion of Western Europe was stopped. The new great Khan changed the direction of Mongol conquest to Afghanistan and Central Asia, which was terrible for them, but Europe was spared. I can't prove it, but I suspect, again, because the church returned to its original call, the gospel, ministering to the poor, that God had mercy. Same way the Celts had re-evangelized Europe. That's what I thought to say. I saw these two dates, Genghis died in 1227. Francis died in 1226. And when I saw those two dates, that just made me, wow. That's why I asked, is it possible that when God's people obey him, fulfill the call he has for his church, that can influence the events in the world, that God will have mercy on nations, will have mercy on us. And that's how I began to think. I knew enough history at that point to remember the Celts. I thought, and the Celts were just before the Islamic invasion. And the Wesleyan revival happened in just before, in the years and decades before the French Revolution. And even secular historians, some have noted and said that it was the Wesleyan Revolution that spared England the reign of terror that France went through. Francis also went to Egypt to try to reach Muslims with the gospel rather than with the sword. He went and asked for an audience with the Muslim Sultan, who was so shocked to hear this Christian monk wanting an audience with him. He invited him to come and see him. And when Francis had finished sharing with him, he said, if all Christians were like you, I might consider becoming one. But he was facing a Christian army who was there with the sword to conquer him. And he was not interested. But it was only a short time later that the Muslims would reconquer Jerusalem from the Crusaders, drive out the crusading armies, and with them they drove out every Western monastic order that had come to Palestine with the crusading armies, except for the Franciscans. The Franciscans were allowed to stay and continue to minister because they had gone to the Sultan with the message of the gospel, message of peace. We see the beginning now of universities in Western Europe, the new flourishing of scholarship. Key in the development of this was a man named Thomas Aquinas. He lived 1225 to 1274. Works of Aristotle had recently been translated from Arabic, and Thomas sought to use Aristotle to find a rational basis for Christianity. Now, his motives were good. He was seeking to improve the church's apologetics. He was interested in reaching Muslims with the gospel. But in focusing on Aristotle and Greek rationalists, he brought a renewed rationalism into the church. He would build on an earlier teacher who Abelard of Paris. So I'm not going to say a lot about Abelard, but Abelard had taken Augustine's saying, "I believe so that I might understand." He had taken and twisted it around and said, "I understand so that I might believe." All of a sudden, human reason took precedence, that we didn't believe something unless we understood it first. Abelard set the seeds of that. Thomas took the form matter motive from Aristotle and Plato and tried to rearrange the biblical narrative of creation, fall, and redemption. So the supernatural world of God, the angels of the church, were the world of form. The natural realm was inferior. There you have the dichotomistic thinking coming in again in a deeper way into the church. The natural realms was inferior, the world of matter. But the rediscovery of Aristotle was key to unleashing the scientific revolution. Aristotle had been discovered because the Muslims had discovered Aristotle in the Middle East when they conquered the Greek-speaking, Greek-ruled Middle East. They found the Greek works of Aristotle. They translated them into Arabic and brought them with them to Muslim schools and universities in Muslim Spain. And they were then translated in Spain, in some of the Christian kingdoms, got a hold of them, a couple of Christian kingdoms still there, got a hold of them, translated them into Latin from Arabic, and they went to the Western universities, the European universities, Christian universities. So Aristotle came to us through the Arabs, but numbers of other things came to us through the Arabs as well. Scientific development was hindered in Western Europe because the Western European numerical system was Roman numerals. The Roman numerals are very cumbersome. They use letters to represent numbers and very limited in what you could do. You could do no serious mathematics with Roman numerals. The Arabs brought us called still today Arabic numerals, the numerals we normally use for doing mathematics. They also brought another gift. It's one of the greatest intellectual revolutions and intellectual tools that's ever been devised, conceived of. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Zero. Zero in combination with with Arabic numerals allows mathematical computation in essence out to infinity. It's one of the greatest intellectual revolutions that has taken place, and it's made modern science possible. Another thing that comes to us from the Arabs, actually even has an Arab name, it's algebra, a mathematical system of measurement. These three discoveries, innovations, combining with the works of Aristotle, the influence of Francis of Assisi in terms of the goodness of nature, the beauty of nature, and the study of nature, science. Aristotle is a scientist, combining with these three gifts through the Arabs would launch the scientific revolution. Scientific revolution that today still continues to transform our world. As we investigate it, we discover it. We can do that because of the innovations that came into Europe through the church and through these people. And talk one of the gifts of the people. I don't talk a lot about the Arabs, but this is the time where I'm making the point of what the Arabs contributed in terms that combined with the Greeks, combined with a biblical worldview growing in Europe, allowed the unleashing the scientific revolution. So you have all of a sudden a people who, you had innovations like the modern plow. And this revolutionized European life. Up until this point, people would drag a stick along the ground and plant seed in the furrow and then cover up the seed. What the plow did was allowed the earth, blade would go deep into the earth and turn it over, which allowed the soil to be enriched, which allowed the deeper, richer soil to be brought to the surface. This allowed the growth of food to increase, would support a larger population, would support a healthier population. Europe's population began to multiply, began to grow because they were eating a healthier way as a result of scientific revolution. This is a period of time where the world is changing, and the church has had a significant role in seeing that happen. Through the universities are developing in the West, and again are involved with development of science. Okay, it's 12, and it's probably a good place to stop. And so if questions, observations.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah. Do you have any like resources, like potentially like slides or some notes that we might be able to look over, um, for just for your lectures?
I'm always happy to share my notes. I don't have a bibliography that goes with the notes, but you're welcome to use my notes. I can. So I have a couple of things I've said I'm going to send you. I'm going to send a list of some books dealing with philosophy.
Yeah.
Some of you were interested in my thesis. I'm happy to include my notes as well.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
I realize you're going through, I'm covering the massive amounts of material and time, and
Yeah.
it's quite big to give you an overview.
Well, yeah, just in general, I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the depth you go into. You know, there's a lot. I like it. I like history, and I enjoy history. But I still have to learn like a lot of new things. You know, I found the whole thing about like the Galatians being part or previously Celtic Gaelic was really surprising to me. I was like, "There's no way," and I looked it up, and oh, actually, yeah, that's true. And that combines some of the resources like City of God. I definitely am going to take an interest in reading that probably. Yeah. And I just really felt it was really well done, very concise, but also like thorough, you know. So yeah, I enjoyed your points and I appreciated the class.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so interesting. Also learning more about Patrick, and the way that he just went into a very pagan society and actually how he brought transformation with the Lord, in that. I was very curious what you were saying about Muhammad and the Islam kind of wars that were going on and conquering many different countries to bring Islam in. And that you said that Islam and Muhammad themselves kind of came from the church's disunity. And I'd never really thought about that before. I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit on why again it was that they didn't come through to Europe. I didn't quite get the firm reasons why. Thank you.
In terms of, again, somewhat, I'm posing a thesis in terms of what I'm saying. And one of the things I did for my master's degree was I took some of the ideas I've been teaching, like this is one of them, and actually put it out in a paper to be reviewed by academics, so I could find out, does this really hold water?
Yes.
But the decisive difference in terms of what happened in the Middle East and what happened in Europe happened at Whitby, the Council of Whitby. And that was where the Celts had to make the decision, do they break with the rest of the church in order to maintain their distinctives, or do they continue to walk in unity with the church? Will they be willing to set aside their different practices in order to unite with the rest of the church so as not to cause division? Now, it's important that they had no idea of the danger that was coming, never heard of Islam at this point. They were making the decision based on not dividing the church. That had two consequences. One was the church remained united, but one of the things that was a result of that, the second consequence, was that the Celts could continue their missions thrust into the rest of Europe. They basically seen on a certain level the conversion of England. now those who had the English and the Saxons who had been converted by the Celts and received some of that missions zeal began the mission to the continent. Now, some Celts had already gone before them, but it allowed that mission to the continent, allowed someone like Boniface to go and preach the gospel throughout Germany, see large conversions throughout Germany, so the re-evangelization of Western Europe. So it was the decision not to divide the church that allowed the Celts to have a significant role in reconverting Western Europe after the repaganization under the Germanic tribes. And that it was a church that had been brought back to life, to re-evangelize Western Europe, and a united church rather than a divided church that faced the Islamic invasion. If Whitby had been decided differently, if the Celts had divided, there wouldn't have been that missions thrust to the continent. It would have been a weak, largely repaganized Western Europe that faced the Islamic invasion.
Wow. Thank you so much.
I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
One of the things I hope to do, and this is why I take time to look at people, is that these are people it's worth getting to know in history. These are people whose lives mattered in their day, and they stand as good examples to us. So I love Patrick. I'm looking forward to meeting him one day. I love Francis. And all these people whose names I've made, they're people whose lives matter. They're people who we are who we are today because they were faithful in their day. And that, to me, says something that's important for us to keep in mind in terms of history. We are the people who represent the kingdom of God at this moment in our history. And how things develop will largely depend on how we are faithful in our day. I think Jesus' word, I think it's Jesus, not Paul, but it is required of a steward that they be found faithful. I want to be found faithful in my day. That's my goal. And these men's stories and women's stories inspire me. I didn't tell the story of Claire, Francis' friend. I'm sorry, I should have. She was a remarkable woman in her own way, and she founded the women's section of the Franciscan order, the Poor Clares. And Francis actually gave San Damiano, when he died, he gave them into the care of the Poor Clares, and they still oversee the church there. But again, she took up that same mantle of being faithful, serving the poor, preaching the gospel. If you get a chance, watch the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. It's a film biography of the early years of the Franciscan movement. It's probably my favorite film of all time. It's beautifully done on many different dimensions, visually, musically. largely faithful. I mean, some sort of dramatization, but largely faithful to the story of Francis. And so you can sometimes find it on YouTube, and it tends to go up and then come down. And you can usually buy it still. But Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, it's exquisite. It's an older movie, slow moving, early 1970s, but beautiful. If you watch it and some of the most unlikely scenes in the movie are the ones that are actually very true to history. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Ed.
Mm.
I would like to ask that if you can close this session in prayer.
I can. Father, I thank you for these students. Again, they are people that desire to be faithful to your truth, to be faithful to your calling in their lives. They're preparing themselves to be more effective to speak into this generation. And as we look at people who are faithful in their day and see how, because of that, they were faithful, that they made a difference in their day. And I pray that you will take their lives and stir them up and help them find the place that you have for them to represent you, to represent the city of God, the kingdom of God in this day, in this generation, that they will see how you're calling them to be faithful to the call of the church, to the gospel, to the poor, to bring your healing into a broken world, and to bring a word of hope. As Augustine did, they would bring hope to this world, work in their hearts. You teach them, Father, in the lives of the men and women throughout history, that they'll be men and women for this time in history, to see your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In Jesus' name I pray.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Ed. And I send you an email about tomorrow because usually on Thursday we start the class at 10. So
Good to
just
know.
that you're aware of it. And if you have the material, you can send it to the email so I can forward it to the students.
Okay, we'll do that.
Yeah. Thank you, Ed.
Thanks,
Hope
Ed.
you have a good afternoon.
You too.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I posted the information.